Alright, let's talk about racism. And look, I know it's not exactly light dinner conversation, it's more like finding a live badger in your pantry. It's deeply unpleasant, you really don't want to deal with it, but ignoring it will only make things worse. Because here's the thing about racism, it's insidious. It's woven into the very fabric of our society, often in ways we don't even realize. It's not just about overt acts of prejudice, it's about the systems and structures that perpetuate inequality and discrimination. We're talking about a problem that has plagued humanity for centuries, a problem that continues to rear its ugly head in countless forms. From the seemingly mundane microaggressions to the horrifying realities of systemic injustice, the impact of racism is undeniable. And if we're being honest with ourselves, we all have a role to play in dismantling it. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. This is about taking a long, hard look in the mirror, acknowledging the uncomfortable truths, and committing ourselves to creating a world where everyone has an equal opportunity to thrive. So buckle up, because we're about to embark on a journey that's both deeply unsettling and absolutely necessary. Let's be clear, racism isn't just a few bad apples, it's the entire orchard, poisoned at the roots. We're talking about systemic inequality, the kind that's baked into our institutions. It's like a virus, infiltrating every aspect of our society. Take education, for instance. We like to think of it as the great equalizer, right? But the reality is far more complicated. Students of color often face a system rigged against them, from underfunded schools and biased disciplinary practices to a lack of representation in textbooks and curriculum. And then there's employment. People of color are consistently underrepresented in higher-paying jobs and overrepresented in low-wage work. They face discrimination in hiring, promotions, and pay. It's like trying to climb a ladder slathered in grease while someone else glides up an escalator right beside you. Housing? Don't even get me started. Redlining, predatory lending practices, and gentrification have all contributed to segregated neighborhoods and a massive racial wealth gap. It's like a cruel game of Monopoly where some players start with hotels on boardwalk and others are stuck in perpetual debt. And let's not forget about healthcare. People of color face significant disparities in access to quality care, leading to higher rates of chronic illness and premature death. It's almost as if their lives are valued less, which, let's be honest, is often the unspoken truth. And the criminal justice system? Well, that's a whole other kettle of rotten fish. From racial profiling and police brutality to sentencing disparities and mass incarceration, the system seems designed to keep people of color down. It's enough to make you wonder if justice is just a word we throw around without any real meaning. The point is this: systemic inequality is not a bug in the system, it's the system, and until we acknowledge that and actively work to dismantle it, we're all complicit in its perpetuation. You know, sometimes racism is like that weird smell in your apartment. You try to ignore it, cover it up with air freshener, pretend it's not there, but deep down, you know it's still lurking. And in this case, that smell is segregation. We may have legally ended segregation decades ago, but let's not kid ourselves, it never really went away. It just evolved, became more insidious, like a virus mutating into a new strain. Today, it manifests as social and economic segregation, dividing communities and perpetuating cycles of poverty and inequality. Imagine this. You're born in a neighborhood starved of resources with underfunded schools, limited job opportunities, and a distinct lack of green spaces. Now imagine that your skin color played a significant role in you ending up there. That, my friends, is the reality for millions of people. This segregation doesn't just happen by chance. It's the result of decades of discriminatory policies and practices, from redlining and housing discrimination to the unequal distribution of resources and opportunities. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the lack of investment and opportunity in certain communities only serves to reinforce existing inequalities. And the consequences are dire. Social and economic segregation leads to concentrated poverty, limited social mobility, and increased crime rates. It creates a system where people are trapped in a cycle of disadvantage, their opportunities stifled from the moment they are born. This segregation also breeds mistrust and misunderstanding between communities. When people live in separate worlds, it's harder to build empathy, to challenge prejudices, and to work together to create a more just and equitable society. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. So, let's stop pretending that segregation is a relic of the past. It's alive and well, poisoning our communities and holding us back from reaching our full potential. The only way to eradicate it is to acknowledge its existence, challenge the systems that perpetuate it, and actively work to create a more integrated and equitable future. Let's talk about something we don't discuss enough: the toll racism takes on mental and physical health. Because here's the thing, racism isn't just an abstract concept, it's a lived experience with very real consequences. Imagine this: you're constantly bombarded with messages, both subtle and overt, that tell you you're less than, that you don't belong, that your life doesn't matter as much. That kind of chronic stress takes a toll, chipping away at your mental and physical well-being. Studies have shown that people of color experience higher rates of stress, anxiety, depression, and PTSD. They're more likely to face discrimination in healthcare settings, receive lower quality care, and die from preventable diseases. It's like being forced to run a marathon with a backpack full of rocks, while everyone else gets a head start and a cheering section. The constant threat of racism, whether it's experiencing microaggressions or fearing for your safety, triggers a stress response in the body. This prolonged exposure to stress hormones can lead to a whole host of health problems, from heart disease and diabetes to weakened immune systems and premature aging. And let's not forget about the intergenerational trauma, the wounds passed down from one generation to the next. The legacy of slavery, segregation, and ongoing discrimination continues to impact the health and well-being of individuals and communities today. It's like a ripple effect, spreading pain and suffering across generations. We can't address health disparities without addressing the root cause: racism. We need to invest in communities of color, provide access to quality healthcare, and create a society where everyone feels safe, valued, and respected. It's time to stop treating the symptoms and start addressing the disease itself. Now let's address the elephant in the room, or rather the raging, hateful rhinoceros in the room: violence and hate crimes fueled by racism. This isn't about hurt feelings or being politically correct. This is about real people being harassed, assaulted, and even killed because of the color of their skin. We've all seen the horrific headlines, the gut-wrenching videos, the stories that make us question humanity itself. From the brutal murders of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, to the countless acts of violence against Black, Asian, Latino, and indigenous communities, the reality is stark and terrifying. These acts of hate aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a deeper sickness, a toxic ideology that dehumanizes entire groups of people based on race, ethnicity, or religion. It's like a cancer spreading through society, poisoning minds and fueling violence. And let's be clear, words have power. Hate speech, online harassment, and the normalization of racist rhetoric all contribute to a climate where violence is more likely to occur. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire, fueling the flames of prejudice and hate. We can't afford to be complacent. We need to condemn racism in all its forms, challenge hate speech, and hold perpetrators accountable. We need to create a society where diversity is celebrated, not feared, and where everyone feels safe and respected. Anything less is simply unacceptable. You know that feeling when you lend someone a favorite book and they return it with a coffee stain on the cover? It's a betrayal of trust, a tiny crack in the foundation of your relationship. Well, imagine that feeling magnified 1,000 times over, applied to entire communities and institutions. That's the erosion of trust caused by racism. Centuries of systemic racism, discrimination, and broken promises have created a chasm of mistrust between marginalized communities and those in power. It's like trying to build a bridge over a raging river of suspicion and resentment. When people of color are consistently profiled by law enforcement, denied equal opportunities and subjected to microaggressions and overt racism, is it any wonder they don't trust the systems that are supposed to protect and serve them? It's like asking someone to trust a chef who keeps serving them burnt food. This erosion of trust has far-reaching consequences. It makes it harder to address social issues, to implement effective policies, and to build bridges between communities. It creates a climate of fear, suspicion, and division, where progress is stifled and inequalities persist. Rebuilding trust requires more than just words. It demands action, accountability, and a genuine commitment to dismantling the systems and structures that perpetuate racism and inequality. It's about listening to marginalized communities, acknowledging their pain and experiences, and working together to create a more just and equitable society. Let's play a game, shall we? Imagine life as a board game, where the goal is to achieve success, happiness, maybe even a little bit of wealth. Sounds fun, right? But here's the catch. Racism has rigged the game. For many people of color, the game starts with fewer resources, limited opportunities, and a whole host of obstacles in their path. It's like starting a race several yards behind the starting line, with a ball and chain shackled to your ankle. We're talking about limited access to quality education, healthcare, housing, and employment opportunities. We're talking about discriminatory lending practices, environmental racism, and the digital divide. It's a system designed to keep certain groups at a disadvantage, to limit their potential and stifle their dreams. Think about it. If you're constantly worried about making rent, putting food on the table, or accessing basic healthcare, it's pretty difficult to focus on things like higher education, career advancement, or even just pursuing your passions. It's like trying to climb a mountain while carrying a refrigerator on your back. This lack of access to resources perpetuates cycles of poverty and inequality, trapping generations in a web of disadvantage. It creates a system where success is determined not by hard work and talent, but by the color of your skin and the zip code you were born into. We need to level the playing field to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed, regardless of their race or background. This means investing in marginalized communities, dismantling discriminatory policies and practices, and creating a system that supports the dreams and aspirations of all its citizens. Here's a sobering thought. The trauma of racism doesn't just disappear with time. It lingers, echoing through generations, leaving an indelible mark on individuals, families, and entire communities. It's like an invisible inheritance passed down alongside eye color and family recipes. Imagine growing up hearing stories of your grandparents being denied basic rights, subjected to segregation, and forced to endure unimaginable hardships because of their race. Imagine carrying the weight of their pain, their anger, their unfulfilled dreams on your shoulders. This is the reality of intergenerational trauma, the transmission of emotional and psychological wounds from one generation to the next. It's the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, and the countless acts of racism and discrimination that continue to plague our society. This trauma can manifest in a myriad of ways, from mental health issues and substance abuse to strained relationships, chronic stress, and physical ailments. It can impact everything from educational attainment and economic mobility to parenting styles and overall well-being. It's like a house with cracks in the foundation. You might try to patch them up, to cover them with fresh paint, but the underlying damage remains, threatening to resurface with the slightest tremor. Addressing intergenerational trauma requires acknowledging its existence, providing access to mental health services, and creating spaces for healing and reconciliation. It's about breaking the cycle of pain and creating a more just and equitable future for generations to come. So, we've delved into the unsettling realities of racism. We've explored its insidious nature, its far-reaching consequences, and its devastating impact on individuals, communities, and society as a whole. But now let's talk about solutions. Addressing racism isn't a spectator sport, it's an all-hands-on-deck situation requiring a collective effort from each and every one of us. We need to acknowledge our own biases, challenge racist jokes and stereotypes, and educate ourselves on the history and ongoing realities of systemic racism. We need to demand accountability from our leaders, support policies that promote equity and justice, and invest in marginalized communities. We need to listen to the voices of those who have experienced racism firsthand, amplify their stories, and stand in solidarity with them. This isn't about being perfect or claiming moral superiority, it's about acknowledging that we all have a role to play in dismantling a system that has caused immeasurable pain and suffering. It's about creating a world where everyone, regardless of their race or background, has the opportunity to thrive. Addressing racism requires a multifaceted approach that involves education, policy reforms, community engagement, leadership accountability, and individual action. By working together, we can create a more just and equitable society for all.